Well, here we are with Godzilla vs. Hedorah, by far the oddest Godzilla movie of all time in the entire franchise. To say this movie is strange is a complete understatement, but that's not saying that's a bad movie exactly, because it's actually one of my favorite Godzilla movies in the Godzilla franchise. Like, seriously, it's a smog-covered gem. Oh boy, you have no idea how this movie terrified me as a kid, because it absolutely just did that. And that's not something Godzilla movies just did, like, no way, absolutely not. But the thing is, though, judging by the comment section of the Godzilla vs. Hedorah trailer, this movie scarred an entire generation. Like, not just me. So I wasn't alone, that's the crazy thing right here. This movie had us all discomforted. It's all about presentation, I'm telling you. Hedorah and her discomforting design, I mean those weird piercing eyes that just stare into your soul, whatever's going on with that low purring sound in her head, like seriously everything. And not to mention, this movie knows when to make use of the music. Certain scenes in this movie just opt to have sound effects of Godzilla and Hedorah just fighting, different splashing sound effects of sludge flying all over the place. It's just very bare minimal at certain points and quiet. I like to also call this the Jurassic Park effect. Now quick, I want to go ahead and say yes, I'm aware Jurassic Park came out many years after this movie, but the idea of what I'm going for when I'm aiming at is the fact that in that movie, when you see a T-Rex escape, it's simply just the T-Rex escaping, sound effects, wires snapping. It lets the sound effects tell the story for you. It needs no music in the background, which to me is really impressive. This movie applies it, but it's just very nihilistic feeling and very empty at certain points. Then you have other scenes which just favor absolute silence. It's a puzzling movie, and I like to call this movie a hallucinogenic. Seriously, this movie you'll sit there and you'll see scenes and think, what the hell did I even see? There's certain cartoons also pop up in this movie from time to time, and this helps hit the message home. This movie has a very much anti-pollution message that's pushed throughout the movie, kind of like in the original one, how there was an anti-nuclear message. I'll be completely honest, I didn't really understand this movie completely when I was a kid. A lot of the cartoons were just spontaneous and just really random, just right over my head, seriously. But nowadays as an adult, and given the fact that environmental messages are still talked about, and the fact that it's pollution is still a big hot topic nowadays, this movie hits a little bit different as an adult. I'll be damned. Seriously, scenes in this movie were certainly overwhelming as a kid. You have this scene, for example. People are alive and chilling. Then after that, in the next moment, once Hedorah flies over, bam, just dead. Suddenly, dead bodies all over the street. Seriously, this movie is a complete acid trip. A complete what the actual fuck. He's seeing dancing fish with human bodies tripping out. A cat covered in sludge? I want to be perfectly clear. I think this movie, its message, is hammered the hardest since the original Godzilla movie. Now here's the thing. I do know after the original Godzilla movie, the anti-nuclear message was definitely throughout all the other Godzilla movies. But the thing was, it was becoming more of a background thing, and it was just less transparent than it was in the first place in the original movies. And by the time Godzilla's Revenge came around, it was just pretty well non-existent by that point. This movie comes around and brings a new message, and it is felt every step of the way as you watch this movie, and it's in the back of your head at every freaking moment. Completely from the mind of director Yoshimitsu Banno, seeing cities covered in black smog, oceans in bad shape. The idea had eventually became a psychological Godzilla horror-styled movie about a giant tadpole from outer space that feeds on man's pollution that is destroying this very planet. Even though this movie traumatized me as a kid, I gotta say as an adult, it has definitely became an A-lister, A-plus Godzilla movie. Actually, at this point, it's probably my favorite Godzilla movie since Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. I'm not saying any of the movies after Godzilla vs. Monster Zero were terrible or bad, with the exception of Godzilla's Revenge, but definitely my interest was going down a little bit. This movie, though, rises the Godzilla series back up. This movie, overall, it wastes no time, because quickly, in no time, Hedorah shows up and starts feeding off our planet as we carelessly destroy it. Gradually, the threat of Hedorah begins to rise. She begins to transform from her water form, eventually flying to the air, then after that to the final form, just feeding off the smokestacks and taking in the toxic fumes. This scene made my skin crawl as a kid. Even as an adult, it still gets me. Hedorah, not quite a match for Godzilla, but she's getting there. Just consuming, slowly consuming. Let's look at this scene in particular. Even though Hedorah is doing nothing at this point, except getting beat down by Godzilla in toxic sludge, is just flying all over the place. The fact that she even exists at this point is not okay in my books. By the next time we see Hedorah, she's on a complete warpath, just releasing toxic gases into the sky. People are falling dead or trying to survive. One scene that I find to be really odd is you have the scene where the youth goes to Mount Fuji and their idea is to celebrate the last day of life, because they all know they're going to die. When they're celebrating, basically there's these old people that show up and just randomly appear. No context on what's with them. I have no idea personally what's with this scene, but part of me kind of believes, after a little research, that it might be the generations beforehand just frowning upon the youth. That's just one speculation. If anybody has any real ideas in the comment section, please let me know, because this is one certain scene that I've always found to be really particularly odd, and I cannot get any answer to exactly. Hold up, if you thought this movie went off the rails enough, guess what? Because you weren't ready for Godzilla flying! Yes, whoever came up with this idea is a brilliant, absolute madman. I absolutely love you. Because this scene ultimately leads to Godzilla giving chase and just forcing Hedorah to her death, which is absolutely relieving in my mind, seeing Godzilla just shredding apart Hedorah because she absolutely deserves it. This was well-needed relief for me. I need to talk about something in my childhood. So the first time I ever saw this movie, it was on a Sci-Fi Channel marathon late night after like 10 o'clock. I had to go to bed to school, early the next morning, like a typical kid. My brother put in a tape and just recorded various different Godzilla movies. This movie only partially recorded, and you know where it cut off? It cut off right here, the absolute worst scene possible that it could cut off. This movie's an absolute treat for me when I watch it as an adult. So many emotions come to mind, and I remember how I felt when I was a kid. You never forget the first time of how you felt during certain things, especially when you're watching certain movies, and it takes you back to that nostalgic feeling of where you were so many years ago. This movie is absolutely it. I think the message for this movie is perfect, and it's still felt to this day. This movie is a perfect blend of cheesiness, a dark tone, and epic show of battling. A great step in the right direction. I'm okay with Godzilla movies targeting kids and understand that was a new demographic after a certain point, but I like how this movie doesn't neglect the older audience and it only grows with you as an adult. This is one of those movies I feel that way about, where as a kid you might not quite understand it, you may have some appreciation for it, but the older you get, you have more and more and more appreciation. Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster or Godzilla vs. Hedorah is just perfect in every aspect because of that. It's a total shame this movie never got a direct sequel, because the ending implies there was supposed to be, and that the work wasn't finished. There was supposed to be a sequel that was supposed to take place in Africa. Who knows how many years after the events of this movie it's supposed to be set, but overall though, we understand though it was a project that was lost in transit, and of course it just never happened because the series would roll on, and of course the following movie, Godzilla vs. Gigan, would happen instead. Even after that sequel was lost, eventually Banno had tried to make another movie called Godzilla 3D to the Max, which would have featured not exactly Hedorah, but a similar concept to the idea of Godzilla vs. Hedorah that would deal with pollution and smog. This is an idea that was wanted to be explored for years and years, and it's something that I want to see a reality in the MonsterVerse. And it feels like a reality due to the fact that Banno was an executive producer for the movies Godzilla vs. Kong and Godzilla King of the Monsters, even though they came out after his death. So, let's hope that we can make this a reality. Still, even after his death, bring Hedorah to the MonsterVerse. That's all I ask. Can you imagine how terrifying he could be in a modern movie with the modern effects they could do? It's something I absolutely want to see. Well, that does it for today's video, and that's a wrap. Up next, we have Godzilla vs. Gigan, so stay tuned and have a great day.